This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Hey, true crime fans. Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Just a note, strangers. This story will probably be a little too scary for our youngest listeners, so discretion is advised. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, would it even be October if we didn't bring you a proper Halloween-themed topic? No, it would not. And what is more classically spooky than a vampire? We've covered the subject before, of course. Episode 32 told the tale of the Mineral Point, Wisconsin vampire, and in episode 71, we discussed the New England vampire panic. And one thing we've gotten into a bit before is the fear around the rising of the undead. That is, after all, one of the main problems with vampires. They have a bad habit of unburying themselves and then wreaking all sorts of jugular-related havoc. Humanity's fear of this violence and the metaphorical relationship between vampirism, mortality, and a variety of other things so complex that we would need to host an entire seminar to get into them, they have led to many, many superstitions. And there are more folkloric bits and pieces regarding vampirism than we can possibly get into here. There's sunlight and crucifixes, and distracting the undead with spilled grains of rice, and avoiding inviting them into your home, the use of garlic, burying them at crossroads, the convenient inability to cross running water. We could go on. But pretty much everyone knows about staking vampires through the heart as a means of permanently dispatching them. In fact, the BBC's History Extra reported that this came from a, quote, medieval Southern Slavic practice. Staking became popular during one of the vampire panics that popped up in Europe. These panics came down to illness or poor understanding of the processes of death and decomposition, and they left several high-profile deceased in a terribly unfortunate state. And we will not even get into the decapitation. After all, this is a family show. But a stake through the heart has certainly become the tried and true method of destroying a vampire. And in many traditions, a suspected vampire is buried with that stake still lodged in its heart. Or, rather horrifically, a vampire suspected after death might be exhumed and staked to make sure that they don't decide to wake up and go for a midnight stroll. Sometimes, they say, you can even spot a vampire's burial site by that very same stake. Now, you might be thinking it would be impossible to ascertain such a thing, what with graves being dug 6 feet deep. But some legends hold that when a tree grows from a burial plot, it's because a wooden stake has taken root and pushed to the surface. There's at least one famous example of this in the United States, in Lafayette Cemetery. Now, that may bring to mind Louisiana, which we all know is the epicenter of vampiric activity in the United States. Just ask Louis and Lestat or even Vampire Bill. But no, not this time. Instead, we are headed to Colorado, where locals tell the tale of a proper Transylvanian who once lived and died in the town of Lafayette. Lafayette, Colorado is a mining town east of Boulder that was founded in the late 19th century. Per its official website, it was begun by Mary Miller, who staked out some land with her late husband, Lafayette. She went on to name the town for him and establish many of its early necessities, such as the bank, of which she was the president. At some point, she developed a portion of her property into mines. Those mines were eventually taken over by a Rocky Mountain Fuel Company, which ran a company town in the very worst sense of the term, controlling the lives of its workers, keeping them in debt via credits owed to the company store, and basically every other practice you've read about in history books. But the town, it still attracted people in need of employment, because that is the way of things. And one of those people was a man named Theodore, Fodor, or, in some versions, Todor Glava. Based on ancestry records that we found, he was likely born around August 1st, 1877, in the region of Romania that was once Transylvania. There's not a lot of information on his early life, but we know that he married a woman named Sophia and that they had a child named Victoria. His family stayed behind when Theodore immigrated to the United States. We don't know if he was planning to return home or if he dreamt of bringing his family to the U.S. Theodore ended up in Lafayette the way that many men did, the coal mining business. Per the Yellow Scene magazine, quote, "The coal mines in the Lafayette area readily recruited Eastern European immigrants to work during the early 1900s, so it's no surprise that Theodore made his way to that particular area of the country. And he was unlucky enough to be living in Colorado when the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic swept through the country. According to the Colorado Sun, the state had the fourth highest reported mortality rates in the entire United States. Sadly, Theodore Glava was one of those casualties. As his obituary, which ran in a December 6 issue of the Lafayette Leader, explained, he died, quote, "suddenly, following an attack of the influenza." It seems he'd been on the road to recovery, so much so that he'd been, quote, "up and about town," but then that he'd taken ill again and passed away. That obituary and what Yellow Scene magazine notes as his retained draft card are the only hard evidence that Glava ever lived in Lafayette. Well, that and the grave. Do you think that you could be manipulated out of a bad habit? Scamfluencers is a weekly podcast from Wondery that takes you along the twists and turns of the most infamous scams of all time, the impact on victims, and what's left once the facade falls away. Scamfluencers recently dove into the story of Richard Bandler, the godfather of modern mental manipulation. He revolutionized the world of self-help, all thanks to an approach he developed called neuro-linguistic programming. Even though NLP worked for some, many called it pseudoscience. NLP methods have been criticized for being dangerous in the wrong hands and inspiring some of the most toxic and criminal self-help movements of the last 2 decades. Throw in Richard's dark past as a cocaine addict and murder suspect, and you can't help but wonder what his true intentions were. Follow Scamfluencers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Scamfluencers and more Exhibit C true crime shows like Morbid and Kill List, early and ad-free, right now by joining Wondery Plus. Check out Exhibit C in the Wondery app for all your true crime listening.
علي الحماس مع منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد. 4 خيارات ماي بوكس تعدلها على كيفك وزيد عليها اختيارات ما لها حدود. اطلب ماي بوكس اليوم وخليها على ذوقك. بيتزا أو ملت كله بكيفك، وطلباتك الجانبية اختر 2 أو مشروب، خياراتك ما تنتهي. هي شروطك وأحكامك اللي ترضي ذوقك. منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد بشروطك وأحكامك. بيتزا هات اطلب اليوم.
Theodore Glava's grave is famous. Or infamous is probably a better word. That's likely down to the rumor that the townspeople did not let that man rest for long. Several blogs dedicated to Colorado legends claim that the early 20th century townsfolk were so frightened of Theodore's uneasy rest that they exhumed his body. Now, why exactly they did this is never made clear. Him being from Transylvania seems to be enough reason for the blogs. But the legends claim the townsfolk might have unearthed him, and they might have found that his nails and teeth were bloody, and they might have reburied him with a stake straight through the heart. That was only to be sure, of course, that he'd stay put. It's alleged that sometime after Theodore Glava was buried, or reburied, in the local cemetery, that strange things began to happen. Many websites cite the appearance of a mysterious figure at the cemetery, one that Random Times described as, quote, a tall, slender man in a dark coat with black hair and long fingernails who sometimes sits on the tombstone. We'd personally guessed the 1980s, when the Cure and Bauhaus records were in plentiful supply, but maybe the story is much older than that. And something else showed up at Theodore's grave, too, the basis of his posthumous fame. A local historian told 9 News that the legend formed that, quote, a tree, supposedly, mysteriously grew up from the grave where his heart would have been. And there were rose bushes scattered near the grave. As Random Times wrote, rumor ascribed those to his, quote, bloody fingernails still growing after death. What's more, the word rose, people claim, is even engraved on his headstone, in Romanian, though misspelled. And strangers, it is true, a tree does grow up from the depths of Theodore Glava's grave. We have seen it ourselves. Now, it is not a particularly ominous tree of the Jupiter variety, but it is certainly there. And if there were once wild rose bushes there, we can't see them. But who knows what order landscaping has wrought over the past century. As for the veracity of claims regarding the stake and bloody fingernails, well, we're just here to verify the presence of vegetation. And the word rose, it is there on his headstone. We also noticed something else in the photos that we reviewed. Flowers and many small objects have been scattered across the gravestone of the man who has become known as the Colorado Vampire. That's apparently become a ritual unto itself, as Atlas Obscura advised in its article on Lafayette Cemetery. It's become the norm to bring a trinket if you visit Theodore's resting place, to leave him something. Why exactly is unclear. Is it to keep him in place? To leave some entertainment for the pale figure who hangs out at the site? Honestly, we're not sure. But it's nice, we guess, that people remember and that they visit, although perhaps not for the most contemplative of reasons. Now, that is all very dramatic. But if you're a longtime listener of the show, you probably know what we're going to say next. As you've likely guessed, strangers, we can find absolutely no archival support for any of the alleged hysteria surrounding Theodore Glava. While we have found plenty of other vampire panics in other places, there's absolutely no historical reference to townsfolk in Lafayette fearing poor Theodore, at least not when he lived or died. When 9 News spoke to a 94-year-old lifelong Lafayette resident back in 2015, he didn't believe a word of the story, and he would have certainly been alive when many of Theodore's contemporaries were still kicking. He told the news station, "Well, if you've lived as long as I have and heard people recite history, there's an awful lot that you can't believe." And Krista Berry, a local museum curator, she told Yellow Scene magazine that she had found no evidence of the story existing in the early 20th century either, or of any gory exhumations ever taking place. Her best guess was that, quote, the folklore surrounding Glava began in the 1950s and 1960s, by high school students because vampire pop culture was in vogue. Those teenagers, they had likely wandered into the cemetery, seen Transylvanian on Theodore's grave, and, well, you can guess the rest. And even beyond that, the tree growing up from Theodore's grave in such a singular way, well, perhaps if there was only one in the cemetery, that would be dramatic. But they are all over the place. People have posted plenty of pictures of Jupiter trees shading graves across the expanse of that lot. Some are quite close to graves. Are we to assume that those poor souls are also staked vampires? Still, there is the small matter of that strange word on Theodore Glava's gravestone. We'll tell you everything engraved there in just a moment. But the one word that's mentioned most, beside Glava's birthplace of Transylvania, is what's described as a misspelling of the Romanian word for rose. Why would decidedly unromantic minors in the midst of a pandemic bother with something like that? What message would they be sending? Could it be a reference to those bloody roses that allegedly sprung up from his fingernails? Well, most certainly not. We personally think it would be a lot easier to chisel "Watch out, vampire" in English if one actually wanted to send a message. And really, after examining the evidence, the idea of a Colorado vampire is simply pretty flimsy. So, ultimately, there's not much more to say about the myths surrounding Theodore Glava. Or there wouldn't be, except for one strange thing. There is a story that lies in Theodore's grave, and in that word, rose. But in the pursuit of a vampire, many have overlooked the history that's right there waiting for them, on that stone. According to the Yellow Scene magazine, Theodore was buried in the Potter's Field of Lafayette Cemetery, what you might know as the Paupers area. It is notable, then, that Theodore had a stone marker at all. The words inscribed upon it are arranged in a very unusual way. They are split into a left side and a right side in 2 columns. At the beginning of each of the columns, there are symbols that look like plus signs, but equally could be crosses. Now, we're going to do our very best with the following pronunciations. But if you happen to speak Romanian, please take it very easy on us. So, first, the left column. It reads plus or cross. 2 Romanians, Trandatir, born in Parhuț, Bucovina. We'll note here that Trandatir is the word that most people believe is a misspelling of Trandafir, which can be translated from Romanian as rose. Now for the right column, it reads plus or cross, Fodor Glava, born in Transylvania, Austro-Hungaria, died December 1918. The gravestone is riddled with misspellings that we cannot properly communicate to you here. Also, Austro-Hungaria is at the bottom, and that may confuse some people. But Romania was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which fell in 1918, and Transylvania was a region in Romania, so that all tracks. But the important bit are the other details. The fact that the information is laid out in 2 separate columns, with Trandafir and a birthplace of a village in Romania listed on the left side, and then Glava's separate birthplace on the right. And of course, those very first words, 2 Romanians. And we bet you've caught on now, strangers. The rose is not a reference to Theodore at all. The point being, of course, that there are 2 people in this grave, not 1. And it's not something any of the legends have bothered with. After all, the vampire thing, it kind of took precedence. Now, some modern bloggers, they have made this deduction, and the mining museum curator has done the necessary digging to discover that the rose wasn't a vague warning. It was the name of another Eastern European immigrant, John Trandafir. Unfortunately, that detail has not translated into any of the legends. That said, we tracked down John's records. He died the very same day as Theodore, and his obituary, it ran in a local newspaper too. It was longer and it was more detailed, perhaps because he'd been in town more permanently, or simply because he'd made stronger bonds. We can't say for sure. What we do know is that John was 27 years old when he died, and his cause of death was listed as pneumonia, not the flu, though certainly the two could be related, or even confused. His funeral details were listed with some detail, unlike Theodore, who had no service mentioned at all. But, all the same, John still ended up, for reasons that we can't explain, in a shared grave with Theodore. While the idea of sharing a grave seems a little, iffy to our modern ears, the fact that the two have a marker at all seems somewhat unusual, given that they are laid to rest in a potter's field. And we must keep in mind that there are much larger shared graves in the United States, mass ones even, that became the final resting places of victims of the Spanish flu. It's likely that these men had no real funds to speak of, but the fact that John had a funeral at the local Greek Orthodox church makes us think it's more likely that he might be the reason that the two got a headstone at all. He might have had enough support from longer-standing connections at the church to gather the necessary money. It's all supposition, of course. And we still have other questions. Why were these two men placed together? Was it simply that they died the same day? Were they close? Was the idea to give them some small sense of their homeland when forced to be separated permanently from families who could never visit their grave? There's no way to know, as the records don't exist. But, strangers, after our research, there is one thing we are sure of. When the Lafayette locals set Theodore and John to rest, there was no notion of a vampire stalking their Colorado town. There was no fear of the Transylvanian struck down by the flu, and there was no thought that John would be forgotten to a legend about the undead. They weren't worried about Count Dracula or invitations into their homes or what to string across their doorways to ward off evil. They weren't thinking about stakes in the heart. They were miners who spent so much of their lives underground. After all, strangers, those men, they were living through a harsh time with a very real killer at the door, and no way to fend it off. There were no rituals to keep the invisible monster, the Spanish flu, at bay, and those miners who dug the grave of Theodore and John, they already knew too much about emptiness and burying things deep to want to unearth them again. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers, from lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. Strangers, we've launched a Substack to tell more stories of the weird that aren't quite long enough for the podcast. Some posts are paid, some are free, but you need to be a subscriber to get them delivered right to your inbox. So, follow the link in our show notes to sign up for a lot more content. It's like a newsletter, but a lot more fun. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you now have 3 options to enjoy 2 extra bonus episodes a month. On Apple Premium and Supercast, you can get the bonus episodes delivered to your app of choice for just $2.99. And for $2 more a month on Patreon, you'll get more fun extras. There you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, 2 full-length bonus episodes, monthly giveaways, blog posts, and occasional live streams, all for $5 a month. We hope you'll check out one of these options to support the show. There's a link in our show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.